The room is colder than it looks. There's a hum in the corner I can't place. Maybe the vent, maybe the light. I used to think it was the building breathing, a slow, mechanical breath that didn't care if I matched it or not. Tonight, I'm trying to match it. Slow in, slow out. It helps me speak plainly, even when plain speech feels like a betrayal of all the quiet I kept. You want to know why, and you want the kind of answer that sits still long enough to be examined from every angle. But I can't give you a specimen under glass. I can only give you the fog that made my choices look logical at the time. There were no thunderclaps. There was a long hallway and a light at the far end that kept flickering, and every time it went dark, I kept moving because stopping in the dark felt worse. I always liked rooms that didn't have windows. People assume that means you're hiding. Sometimes it just means you want the world to stop tugging at you. I worked long hours. I came home to the same four walls, and I preferred it that way. Controlled angles, controlled sound. If there were voices outside my door, I could wait them out. If the city pushed through the seams with sirens and laughter, I could shut it off with the fan. I liked things that could be turned off. It started with a need that disguised itself as kindness. When you've been left enough times, you tell yourself you're simply asking for company. You tell yourself you'll be gentle. You tell yourself you just want the night to be longer than usual, that you want this moment, this face, this voice to stay in the same room as you until the hum changes pitch and the sun admits defeat for one more hour. It sounds harmless said that way, doesn't it? It sounded harmless in my head too. That's the trick. The mind makes a museum out of intentions and puts velvet ropes around the consequences. I collected routines. That was my first sin, if you want a taxonomy. I learned which evenings were quietest, which corners of the neighborhood folded up early, which stores sold the cheapest dinners in plastic packages that you could heat at 2 a.m. without waking anyone. I learned the scripts that make strangers comfortable, the right softness in the voice, the right distance to stand from a doorway, the right light in a room to make the edges blur and the hours loosen. I learned to be a person I could wear like a coat, polite on cue, unremarkable on exit. When people talk about monsters, they picture teeth. My teeth were words. Teeth keep things in. Words keep people near. I said the things that sounded like safety. You can rest here. No rush. You're fine. Stay if you want. And I told myself that wanting someone to stay wasn't a crime. But the wanting grew heavy. It slid from request to requirement without raising its voice. You can't hear that transition from the outside. It's quiet. It's reasonable. It rolls in like fog. I kept the apartment dim on purpose. Not to hide anything. At least that's what I said at the time. I told myself the low light was a kindness, a mercy for tired eyes. But the truth is that in the half-light, faces look like memories. People become shapes you can arrange closer or further. And in that in-between, I was strongest. In bright light, you have to be the person you are. In dusk, you can be the person you've rehearsed. I learned the city's heartbeat, which streets blinked, at which hours, where the night ran thin, where the morning refused to arrive on time. That knowledge made me feel competent, like I'd found a profession no one had named. I could predict the music of the pipes, the elevator shudder, the intermittent rattle of a neighbor dragging a chair. I synchronized myself to those rhythms until my mind didn't have to think. And when the mind stops thinking, it becomes very easy to persuade yourself that what you're doing is just living. I didn't see people as objects. That's what some would say after, when they need the comfort of a simple diagnosis. I saw them as vanishing points. A conversation opens, Laughter spills out, a hand covers a yawn, and then there's the moment I learned to dread. The looking at the door. It's so small, that glance. It's a pebble you can ignore until it becomes an avalanche. And once you've experienced enough goodbyes that are not really goodbyes, but rehearsals for future absences, you start to fear the rehearsal more than the performance. You start thinking, what could I do to keep the scene from ending? There are gentler people than me who answer that question with prayer, or music, or letting go. I answered it with a new habit. I dragged time. I pulled at it like a stubborn drawer. I made rooms smaller so moments would have fewer places to escape. I made promises to myself that sounded sane. Just one more hour, just one more story, just one more drink. Nothing cruel about that, right? That's how I framed it. But framing is only useful for hiding the edges. I curated my days around the possibility of company. I kept things tidy enough to pass, but not sterile. Lived in like a set. I learned how to mask the sense of worry and make them smell like soap and spice. I could polish a silence until it reflected what I wanted it to show. When you practice that long enough, you begin to believe that your version of events is the truth. The truth, however, is unruly. It has a way of seeping back under doors. Sometimes I tell myself I was trying to build a place where loneliness would get bored and leave. I made the rooms patient. I made the hours soft. I turned the television to a channel that played voices at a low murmur. So if conversations stalled, the air would keep talking. I thought I was creating comfort. I was building a trap for myself. Because once I realized I could orchestrate an evening like a conductor, I forgot that other people were not instruments. They were not mine to tune. You want me to say it plain? I wanted to keep people who were never mine to keep. I wanted to pin butterflies without knowing that meant stopping wings. Even now, that sounds like a metaphor that forgives too much. I won't forgive it. I'm borrowing the image to help you see how easy it is, at first, to confuse admiration with possession. If you hold your breath enough times during the best parts of a night, you start believing you're the one who controls whether it continues. When the neighbors complained about the smell, I can say that much, there's no harm in it. My first thought wasn't that I'd crossed any red line. It was that the world was finally interested in me. How twisted is that? Attention as validation, as proof that I existed. It didn't feel like being caught. It felt like being seen. That's how far gone I was. You could argue that's the most honest description of the sickness I carried. Seeing disaster as recognition. I want to be careful. There are things I will not describe. I will not offer you pictures to carry out of this room. But I will say that I mistook closeness for ownership. I believed that if someone trusted me enough to step into my space, I could press pause on them. That I could freeze a night in place and live inside it for as long as I needed. No one told me that pressing pause is another word for stealing time that doesn't belong to you. No one told me because I didn't ask. I curated a silence around myself thick enough to keep out the questions I didn't want to answer. There were warnings before the blue lights. Small domestic storms I ignored. A knock that lingered. A curious glance from a neighbor carrying groceries. A landlord who wanted to check the pipes and had to reschedule too many times. Each of those moments could have been a mirror. I chose to look away. Pride is a blindfold that pretends to be a crown. The night ended quietly. No heroics, no chase. A conversation at the door that lasted longer than a conversation at a door should. Faces trying to make sense of my face. A request to step inside. A pause where I weighed whether words could return the world to the size of my rooms. They could not. When the world finally stepped in, it brought light with it. Not the kind you switch on, the kind that strips varnish. They asked me why. I said the truth that isn't satisfying. I was lonely, and I was afraid of endings. The other truth, that I made choices to satisfy that fear, choices that turned other people's lives into settings for my comfort, stayed behind my teeth. Not because I was trying to lie, but because I didn't yet have the language to name it without pretending I was smaller than the harm. In here, language is all you have. The day is divided into pieces, labeled with numbers and rules, and you learn to narrate yourself back into a person who can stand up without a push. I've been telling this story to the ceiling for months. The ceiling is unimpressed. It doesn't need me to be interesting. It just needs me to be honest. Honesty looks like this. I didn't wake up one morning a stranger to myself. I engineered myself piece by piece into someone who could watch the light go out of a room and call that peace. I trained for it by treating my own life like a basement, somewhere to stash the things I couldn't face in the daylight. And every time I chose the basement, every time I told myself the next time I'd be better, I taught the darkness how to make itself comfortable. The papers wrote their names. They should have. The story is theirs. Mine is a footnote, a warning sign if you want to be generous, a cautionary tale if you want to be useful. I think about those names when the wing of night passes over this place, and the corridors go quiet, and the hum deepens to that underwater sound. I imagine their mornings that never arrived, their friends waiting at corners that no longer matter, the laughter paused in their throats. I don't let myself imagine beyond that. I don't deserve their futures. I already took too much. Remorse is not a redemption arc. It's maintenance, a thing you do daily so you never forget what you did when you stopped looking beyond yourself. Some days remorse feels like an anchor, and I tell myself, that's justice, weight that keeps you from floating into amnesia. Other days it feels like a lantern, and I tell myself, that's mercy, light that keeps you from tripping over the same step again. Neither of those metaphors changes the floor I'm standing on. You asked for the why. Maybe the better question is the how. How did I let the need to be accompanied mutate into the right to be obeyed? How did I turn trust into a lever I pulled whenever I felt the night thinning? The answer is ugly. Practice. Repetition polishes even the cruelest habits. I rehearsed kindness without surrender. I rehearsed openness with conditions. I rehearsed tenderness that started warm and ended in ownership. And because the world is busy and neighbors are tired and everyone is carrying their own emergencies, I was allowed to keep rehearsing until the performance looked like a life. If there's a lesson, it isn't for me. My lessons arrived too late to save anyone. The lesson is for the version of me that exists in people you haven't met yet. The quiet collector of moments. The person who calls possession love. The one whose apartment always smells like something recently disguised. Watch for the way they speak to time. If they talk about evenings like prey, if they describe companionship as a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be shared, step back. The slope is steeper than it looks. I won't ask for forgiveness here. Forgiveness is a language I no longer speak. What I can say is that I understand now that love without release is not love at all. It's hunger in costume. And I understand that my costume fit too well. I told people they were safe because I wanted to believe I was safe. Safety isn't something you can borrow and return without marks. At night, when the guards make their rounds and the footsteps move past my door, I think of all the rooms I turned into traps, all the nights I stiff-armed into stillness like a bully holding down a clock. I was building a mausoleum for my fear of abandonment and asking the living to guard it with me. There's a word for that. You don't need me to say it out loud to hear it. I can give you this, though. The before doesn't excuse the after, but it can warn you about the now. If there's someone in your orbit who fetishizes permanence, who talks about keeping rather than being with, who praises quiet, not as peace, but as control, listen to the part of your body that tightens. That's your future speaking. Believe it. Leave. The hum is softer now. Maybe I finally matched it. Maybe it got tired of competing with my voice. I can stop here without a flourish. No redemption monologue, no grand moral. Just a man who dressed his emptiness in manners, who turned his fear of being left into a project that erased other people, who mistook the stillness of a room for consent. I don't deserve to finish in poetry, but I can say this plainly, for whoever needs to hear it. If you want someone to stay, you ask, and you accept the answer. If you can't accept the answer, you leave the room before you turn the door into a lock. If you can't leave the room, you don't invite anyone in. You live with your own echo until you learn how to listen without needing to own the voice that speaks back. That's what I should have done. That's the only true thing I have left to offer.